Welcome, my darlings. Make yourself comfortable, and I have a tale to tell you. If you enjoy it, please be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and leave me a comment. I always enjoy your comments. Now, let us begin. The Mountains of Madness by H.P. Lovecraft. Chapter 5. I think that both of us simultaneously cried out in mixed awe, wonder, terror, and disbelief in our own senses as we finally cleared the pass and saw what lay beyond. Of course, we must have had some natural theory in the back of our heads to steady our faculties for the moment. Probably we thought of such things as the grotesquely weathered stones of the Garden of the Gods in Colorado, or the fantastically symmetrical wind-carved rocks of the Arizona desert. Perhaps we even half thought the sight of a mirage like that we had seen the morning before on our first approaching those mountains of madness. We must have had some such normal notion to fall back upon as our eyes swept that limitless, tempest-scarred plateau and grasped the almost endless labyrinth of colossal, regular, and geometrically eurythmic stone masses which reared their crumpled and pitted crests above a glacial sheet not more than 40 or 50 feet deep at its thickest, and in places obviously thinner. The effect of the monstrous sight was indescribable, for some fiendish violation of known natural law seemed certain at the outset. Here, on a hellishly ancient tableland, fully 20,000 feet high, and in a climate deadly to habitation since a pre-human age, not less than 500,000 years ago, there stretched, nearly to the victim's limit, a tangle of orderly stone, which only the desperation of mental self-defense could possibly attribute to any but a conscious and artificial cause. We had previously dismissed so far, as serious thought was concerned, any theory that the cubes and ramparts of the mountainside were other than natural in origin. How could they be otherwise, when man himself could scarcely have been differentiated from the great apes at the time when the region succumbed to the present unbroken reign of glacial death? Yet now the sway of reason seemed irrefutably shaken, for this cyclopsean maze of squared, curved, and angled blocks had features which cut off all comfortable refuge. It was very clearly the blasphemous city of the mirage in stark, objective, and ineluctable reality. This damnable portion had had a material basis after all. There had been some horizontal stratum of ice dust in the upper air, and this shocking stone survival had projected its image across the mountains, according to the simple laws of reflection. Of course, the phantom had been twisted and exaggerated, and had contained things which the real source did not contain. Yet now, as we saw the real source, we thought even more hideous and menacing than its distant image. Only the incredible, inhuman massiveness of these vast stones, towers, and ramparts had saved the frightful thing from utter annihilation. In the hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years it had brooded there, amidst the blasts of a bleak upland. Corona mundi, roof of the world, all sorts of fantastic phrases sprang to our lips as we looked dizzyingly down at the unbelievable spectacle. I thought again of the eldritch primal myths that had so persistently haunted me since my first sight of this dead Arctic world, of the demonic plateau of Lang, of the Migo or abominable snowmen of the Himalayas, of the Pnakotic manuscripts with their pre-human implications, of the Cthulhu cult, of the Necronomicon, and the Hyperborean legends, a formless Sagathio, and the worse than formless star spawn associated with that seminity. For boundless miles in every direction, the thing stretched off with very little thinning. Indeed, as our eyes followed it to the right and left along the base of the low, gradual foothills which separated it from the actual mountain rim, we decided that we could see no thinning at all except for an interruption of the left of the pass through which we had come. We had merely struck at random a limited part of something of incalculable extent. The foothills were more sparsely sprinkled with grotesque stone structures, linking the terrible city to the already familiar cubes and ramparts, which evidently formed the mountain outposts. These later, as well as the queer cave mouths, were as thick on the inner as on the outer side of the mountains. The nameless stone labyrinth consisted for the most part of walls from 10 to 150 feet in ice-clear height and of thickness varying from 5 to 10 feet. It was composed mostly of prodigious blocks of dark primordial slate, schist and sandstone, blocks in many cases as large as 4 by 6 by 8 feet, though in several places it seemed to be carved out of solid, uneven bedrock of Precambrian slate. The buildings were far from equal in size, there being innumerable honeycomb arrangements of enormous extent as well as smaller separate structures. The general shape of these things tended to be conical, pyramidal, or terraced, though there were many perfect cylinders, perfect cubes, clusters of cubes, and other rectangular forms. A peculiar sprinkling of angled edifices whose five-pointed ground plan roughly suggested modern fortifications. The builders had made constant and expert use of the principle of the arch, and domes had probably existed in the city's heyday. The whole tangle was monstrously weathered, and the glacial surface from where the towers projected was strewn with fallen blocks and immemorial debris. Where the glaciations were transparent, we could see the lower part of the gigantic piles, and we noticed the ice-preserved stone bridges which connected the different towers at varying distances above the ground. On the exposed wall we could detect sacred places where other and higher bridges of the same sort had existed. Closer inspection revealed countless large windows, some of which were closed with shutters of a petrified material, originally wood, though most gaped open in a sinister and menacing fashion. Many of the rooms, of course, were roofless, and with uneven though wind-rounded upper edges, whilst others, of more sharply conical or pyramidal model, or else protected by higher surrounding structures, preserved intact outlines despite the omnipresent crumbling and pitting. With the field glass we could barely make out what seemed to be sculptural decorations in horizontal bands, decorations including those curious groups of dots whose presence on the ancient soapstones now assumed a vastly larger significance. In many places the buildings were totally ruined, and the ice sheet deeply riven from various geological causes. In other places the stonework was worn down to the very level of the glaciation. One broad swath, extending from the plateau's interior to a cleft in the foothills about a mile to the left of the pass we had just traversed, was wholly free from the buildings. It probably represented, we concluded, the course of some great river, which in tertiary times, millions of years ago, had poured through the city and into some prodigious subterranean abyss of the Great Barrier Range. Certainly this was, above all, a region of caves, gulfs, and underground secrets beyond human penetration. Looking back to our sensations and recalling our dazedness at viewing this monstrous survival from aeons we had thought pre-human, I can only wonder that we preserved the semblance of equilibrium, which we did. Of course, we knew that something, chronology, scientific theory, or our own consciousness was woefully awry. Yet we kept enough poise to guide the plane, observe many things quite minutely, and take a careful series of photographs, which may yet serve both us and the world in good stead. In my case, ingrained scientific habit may have helped, for above all my bewilderment and sense of menace, there burned a dominant curiosity to fathom more of this age-old secret, to know what sort of beings had built and lived in this incalculably gigantic place, and what relation to the general world of its time, or of other times so unique a concentration of life could have had. For this place could be no ordinary city. It must have formed the primary nucleus and center of some archaic and unbelievable chapter of Earth's history, whose outward ramifications, recalled only dimly in the most obscure and distorted myths, had vanished utterly amidst the chaos of terrene convulsions long before any human race we know had shambled out of apedom. Here sprawled a Paleogean megalopolis compared with which the fabled Atlantis and Lemuria, Comerium and Uzuldirround and Olathi in the land of the Lomar are recent things of today, not even of yesterday. A megalopolis ranging with such whispered pre-human blasphemies as Valursai, Reilich, Ib in the land of Namar, and the nameless city of Arabia Deserta. As we flew above the tangle of stark Titan towers, my imagination sometimes escaped all bounds and roved aimlessly in realms of fantastic associations, even weaving links betwixt this lost world and some of my own wildest dreams concerning the mad horror at the camp. The plane's fuel tank, in the interest of greater lightness, had been only partially filled. Hence we now had to exert caution in our exploration. Even so, however, we covered an enormous extent of ground, or rather air, after swooping down to a level where the wind became virtually negligible. There seemed to be no limit to the mountain range, or at least the length of the frightful stone city which bordered its inner foothills. 50 miles of flight in each direction showed no major change in the labyrinth of rock and masonry that clawed up corpse-like through the eternal ice. There were, though, some highly absorbing diversifications, such as the carvings on the canyon where the broad river had once pierced the foothills and approached its sinking place in the Great Range. The headlands at the stream's entrance had boldly carved into cyclopsean pylons, and something about the ridgy, barrel-shaped design stirred up oddly vague, hateful, and confusing semi-remembrances in both Danforth and me. We also came upon several star-shaped open spaces, evidently public squares, and noted various undulations in the terrain. Where a sharp hill rose, it was generally bellowed out onto some sort of rambling stone edifice, but there were at least 2 exceptions. On these latter, one was too badly weathered to disclose what had been on the jutting eminence, while the other still bore a fantastic conical monument carved out of solid rock and roughly resembling such things as the well-known snake tomb in the ancient valley of Petra. Flying inland from the mountains, we discovered that the city was not of infinite width, even though its length along the foothills seemed endless. After about 30 miles, the grotesque stone buildings began to thin out, and in 10 more miles, we came to an unbroken waste, virtually without a sign of sentient artifice. The course of the river beyond the city seemed marked by a broad, depressed line, while the land assumed a somewhat greater ruggedness, seemed to slope slightly upward as it receded into the mist-hazed west. So far, we had made no landing, yet to leave the plateau without an attempt to enter some of the monstrous structures would have been inconceivable. Accordingly, we decided to find a smooth place on the foothills near our navigable pass, there grounding the plane and preparing to do some exploration on foot. Through these gradual slopes were partly covered with a scattering of ruins. Low-flying soon disclosed an ample number of possible landing places. Selecting that nearest to the pass, since our next flight would be across the Great Range and back to camp, we succeeded about 12:30 p.m. in coming down on a smooth, hard snowfield, wholly devoid of obstacles and well adapted to a swift and favorable takeoff later on. It did not seem necessary to protect the plane with the snow banking for so brief a time, and in so comfortable an absence of high winds at this level. Hence we merely saw that the landing skies were safely lodged and that the vital parts of the mechanism were guarded against the cold. For our foot journey we discarded the heaviest of our flying furs and took with us a small outfit consisting of pocket compass, hand camera, light provisions, voluminous notebooks and papers, geologist's hammer and chisel, specimen bags, coil of climbing rope, a powerful electric torches with extra batteries. This equipment having been carried in the plane of the chance that we might be able to effect a landing, take ground pictures, make drawings and topographical sketches, and obtain rock specimens from some bare slope, outcrop, or mountain cave. Unfortunately, we had a supply of extra paper to tear up, place in a spare specimen bag, and use on ancient principle of hare and hounds for marking our course in any interior mazes we might be able to penetrate. This had been brought up in case we found some cave system with air quiet enough to allow such a rapid and easy method in place of the usual rock-clipping method of trailblazing. Walking cautiously downhill over the crusted snow towards the stupendous stone labyrinth that loomed against the opalescent west, we felt almost as keen a sense of eminent marvels as we had felt on approaching the unfathomed mountain pass 4 hours previously. True, we had become virtually familiar with the incredible secret concealment by the barrier peaks, yet the prospects of actually entering primordial walls reared by conscious beings, perhaps millions of years ago, before any known race of men could have existed, was none the less awesome and potentially terrible in its implication of cosmic abnormality. Through the thinness of the air at this prodigious altitude made exertion somewhat more difficult than usual. Both Danford and I found ourselves bearing up very well, and felt equal to almost any task which might fall to our lot. It took only a few steps to bring us to a shapeless ruin, worn level with the snow, while 10 or 15 rods further on there was a huge, roofless rampart, still complete in its gigantic 5-point outline, and rising to an irregular height of 10 or 11 feet. For this latter we headed, and when at last we were actually able to touch its weathered cyclopsean blocks, we felt that we had established an unprecedented and almost blasphemous link with forgotten aeons normally closed to our species. This rampart, shaped like a star and perhaps 300 feet from point to point, was built of Jurassic sandstone blocks of irregular size, averaging 6 by 8 feet in surface. There was a row of arched loopholes or windows about 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, spaced quite symmetrically along the points of the star, and at its inner angle, and with the bottoms about 4 feet from the glaciated surface. Looking through these, we could see that the masonry was fully 5 feet thick, that there was no partition remaining within, and that there were traces of banded carvings or bas-relief on the interior walls. Facts we had indeed guessed before, when flying low over this rampart and others like it. The lower parts must have originally existed. All traces of such things were now wholly obscured by the deep layer of ice and snow at this point. We carved through one of the windows and vainly tried to decipher the nearly effaced mural designs, but did not attempt to disturb the glaciated floor. Our orientation flights had indicated that many buildings in the city proper were less ice-choked, and that we might perhaps find wholly clear interiors leading down to the true ground level, if we enter those structures still roofed at the top. Before we left the rampart, we photographed it carefully and studied its mortarless Cyclopsian masonry with complete bewilderment. We wished that Pabodie were present, for his engineering knowledge might have helped us guess how much titanic blocks could have been handled in that unbelievably remote age when the city and its outskirts were built up. The half-mile walk downhill to the actual city, with the upper wind shrieking vainly and savagely through the skyward peaks in the background, was something of which the smallest detail will always remain engraved on my mind. Only in fantastic nightmares could any human being but Danforth and me conceive such optical effects. Between us, the churning vapors of the west lay that monstrous tangle of dark stone towers, its outre and incredible forms impressing us afresh at every new angle of vision. It was a mirage in solid stone, and were it not for the photographs, I still doubt that such things could be. The general type of masonry was identical with that of the ramparts we had examined, but the extravagant shapes which this masonry took in its urban manifestations were all past description. Even the pictures illustrate only one or two phases of its endless variety, preternatural massiveness and utter alien exoticism. There were geometrical forms for which a Euclid could scarcely find a name. Cones of all degrees of irregularity and truncation, terraces of every sort of provocation, disproportionate staffs with odd buttons, enlargements, broken columns in curious groups, and 5-pointed or 5-ridged arrangements of mad grotesqueness. As we drew near, we could see beneath certain transparent parts of the ice sheet, and detected some of the tubular stone bridges that connected the crazily sprinkled structures at various heights. Of orderly streets there seemed to be none, the only broad opening swath being a mile to the left, where the ancient river had doubtless flowed through the town into the mountains. Our field glasses showed the external, horizontal bands of nearly effaced sculptures and dot groups to be very prevalent, and we could half imagine what the city must once have looked like, even though most of the roofs and tower tops had necessarily perished. As a whole, it had been a complex tangle of twisted lanes and alleys, all of them deep canyons, and some little better than tunnels because of the overhanging masonry or overarching bridges. Now outspread below us, it loomed like a dream fantasy up against a westward mist, through which northern end the low, reddish Antarctic sun of early afternoon was struggling to shine. And when for a moment that sun encountered a denser obstruction and plunged the scene into temporary shadow, the effect was subtly menacing in a way that I can never hope to depict. Even the faint howling and piping of the unfelt wind in the great mountain pass behind us took on a wilder note of purposeful malignity. The last stage of our descent to town was unusually steep and abrupt, and a rock outcropping at the edge where the grade changed led us to think that an artificial terrace had once existed there. Under the glaciation, we believed there must be a flight of steps or its equivalent. When at last we plunged into the town itself, clambered over fallen masonry and shrinking from the oppressive nearness and dwarfing height of omnipresent crumbling and pitted walls, our sensation again became such that I marveled at the amount of self-control we retained. Danforth was frankly jumpy and began making some offensively irrelevant speculations about the horror at the camp, which I resented all the more because I could not help sharing certain conclusions forced upon us by many features of this morbid survival from nightmare antiquity. The speculations worked on his imagination too, for in one place, where a debris-littered alley turned a sharp corner, he insisted that he saw faint traces of ground markings which he did not like, whilst elsewhere he stopped to listen to a subtle imaginary sound from some undefined point, a muffled musical piping, he said, not unlike that of the wind in the mountain caves, yet somehow disturbingly different. The ceaseless 5 points of the surrounding architecture and of the few distinguishable mural arabesques had a dimly sinister suggestiveness we could not escape, and gave us a touch of terrible conscious certainty concerning the primal entities which had reared and dwelled in this unhallowed place. Nevertheless, our scientific and adventurous souls were not wholly dead, and we mechanically carried out our program of chipping specimens from all the different rock types represented in the masonry. We wished a rather full set in order to draw a better conclusion regarding the age of this place. Nothing in the great outer walls seemed to date from later than the Jurassic and Comanchean periods, nor was any piece of stone in the entire place of a greater recency than the Pliocene age. In stark certainty, we were wandering amidst a death which had reigned at least 500,000 years, and in all probability even longer. As we proceeded through the mass of stone-shadowed twilight, we stopped at all available apertures to study interiors and investigate entrance possibilities. Some were above our reach, while others led only into ice-choked ruins, as unroofed and barren as the rampart on the hill. One, though spacious and inviting, opened on a seemingly bottomless abyss, without visible means of descent. Now and then we had a chance to study the petrified wood of a surviving shutter. There were impressed by fabulous antiquity implied in all discernible grain. These things had come from Mesozoic gymnosperms and conifers, especially Cretaceous cycads, and from fan palms and early angiosperms of plain tertiary date. Nothing definite later than the Pliocene could be discovered. In the placing of these shutters, whose edges showed the former presence of queer and long-vanished hinges, usage seemed to be varied, some being on the outer and some on the inner side of the deep embrasures. They seemed to have become wedged in place, thus surviving the rusting of their former and probably metallic fixtures and fastenings. After a time we came across a row of windows in a bulge of a colossal 5-edged cone of undamaged apex, which led into a vast, well-preserved room with stone flooring. But these were too high in the room to permit descent without a rope. We had a rope with us, but did not wish to bother with the 20-foot drop unless obliged to, especially in this thin plateau air where great demands were made upon the heart action. The enormous room was probably a hall or concourse of some sort, and our electric torches showed bold, distinct, and potentially startling sculptures arranged around the walls in broad horizontal bands, separated by equally broad strips of conventional arabesques. We took careful note of this spot, planning to enter unless a more easily gained interior was encountered. Finally, though, we did encounter exactly the opening we wished, an archway about 6 feet wide and 10 feet high, marking the former end of an aerial bridge which had spanned an alley about 5 feet above the present level of glaciation. These archways, of course, were flush with the upper story floors, and in this case, one of the floors still existed. The building thus accessible was a series of rectangular terraces on our left, facing westward, that across the alley, where the other archway yawned, was a decrepit cylinder with no windows and with a curious bulge about 10 feet above the aperture. It was totally dark inside, and the archway seemed to open on a well of illimitable emptiness. Heaped debris made the entrance to the vast left-hand building doubly easy, yet for a moment we hesitated before taking advantage of the long-wished chance. For though we had penetrated into this tangle of archaic mystery, it required fresh resolution to carry us actually inside a complete and surviving building of a fabulous elder world whose nature was becoming more and more hideously plain to us. In the end, however, we made the plunge and scrambled up over the rubble into the gaping embrasure. The floor beyond was of great slate and seemed to form the outlet of a long, high corridor with sculptured walls. Observe the many inner archways which led off from it, and realizing the probable complexity of the nest of apartments within, we decided that we must begin our system of hare and hound trailblazing. Hitherto, our compasses, together with the frequent glimpses of vast mountain range between the towers in our rear, had been enough to prevent our losing our way. But from now on, the artificial substitute would be necessary. Accordingly, we reduced our extra paper to shreds of suitable size, placed these in a bag to be carried by Danforth, and prepared to use them as economically as safety would allow. This method would probably gain us immunity from straying, since there did not appear to be any strong air currents inside the primordial masonry. If such should develop, or if our paper's supply should give out, we could, of course, fall back on the more secure thought, more tedious and retarding method of rock chipping. Just how extensive an exterior we had opened up, it was impossible to guess without a trial. The close and frequent connection of the different buildings made it likely that we might cross from one to another on bridges underneath the ice, except where impeded by local collapses and geologic rifts, for very little glaciation seemed to have entered the massive constructs. Almost all areas of transparent ice has revealed the submerged windows as tightly shuttered as if the town had been left in that uniform state until the glacial sheet came to crystallize the lower parts for all succeeding time. Indeed, one gained a curious impression that this place had been deliberately closed and deserted in some dim, bygone aeon, rather than overwhelmed by any sudden calamity or even gradual decay. Had the coming of the ice been foreseen, and had a nameless population left en masse to seek a less doomed abode? The precise physiographic conditions attending the formation of the ice sheet at this point would have to wait for later solution. It had not very plainly been a grinding drive. Perhaps the pressure of accumulating snows had been responsible, and perhaps some flood from the river or from the bursting of some ancient glacial dam in the Great Range had helped to create the special state now observable. Imagination could conceive almost anything in connection with this place. What? You're still here after the whole story? I really appreciate that, darlings. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't. And I always love to hear from you. Have a glorious day, my darlings.